Hi, it's Miss Blanchard here with our third lecture for Chapter 19, and today we're going to be talking about labor, and organized labor that is, in terms of unionism. Okay, so to begin, industrial work during the Gilded Age is very difficult. These large, heavy machines, hot factories, things that are moving very quickly like assembly lines, all lead to a very dangerous work environment. Laborers are working long hours, 10, sometimes 12-hour days, and receive low wages, but often have very expensive living costs despite the low wages. And we're going to talk later, especially in terms of Pullman, about company towns, where companies paid workers, but then the workers had to live in the company town and pay rent and grocery bills back to the corporation. And a lot of times their wages are not enough to even pay the rent and food. Industrial work is largely unskilled, and especially a lot of the incoming immigrants are going to become known as green hands. If you're green at something, you're a novice, you're a beginner at something, and that's what these incoming immigrants were. They were coming to the United States without any experience in a lot of these professions, and then come to dominate them because they will accept such low wages. It's also very dangerous, and after the invention of the assembly line, very monotonous, which leads to actually a lot of job dissatisfaction, but even worse than that, job industries, people becoming clumsy and careless because they're doing the same repetitive motion for 10 to 12 hours a day with no break and no change. And by dangerous, I mean that 1 in every 12 industrial workers is going to suffer some significant on-job accident. For railroad workers, that rate is actually higher. It drops to about 1 in 8. And fatalities are going to be about 1 in every 25 industrial workers are going to die on the job. This is a very dangerous environment. And then you have a lot of discrimination. Gender, male and female, are going to be paid differently, but also religious. Protestants are going to be paid much more than Catholic immigrants, and then Jewish immigrants that, at least in like the New York area, tend to dominate a lot of the textile industries, are going to make less money. And so these conditions lead to a very small but significant union movement. Workers are organizing stronger unions, and now you're going to start to see the first significant strikes. When we had talked about with the first industrial revolution, the GTU and the NTU, we had talked about some strikes, some significantly occurring at like the Lowell mills. Now you're going to see the first large-scale strikes and labor parties that endorse candidates. Henry George runs for the mayor of New York on the United Labor Party ticket, but he does not win. He does finish second. And in the late 1880s, labor parties start to win seats in local elections, especially in city councils and state legislatures, in industrial areas like New York and Massachusetts, where workers are starting to outnumber other classes. And so the Gilded Age in general sees a rise in political organizations, especially among the working poor, labor unions, and women. And groups like the WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, although women can't vote, advocate temperance, race relations, and the right for women to vote. So let's start with the Knights of Labor. The book talks a little bit about the 8-hour league that wanted to see 8 hours for work, 8 hours for leisure, and 8 hours for sleep. And the Knights of Labor is going to pick up there and try to help workers escape the wage system. They're led by Terence V. Powderly, but he is kind of a weak and ineffective leader, and really the problem with the Knights of Labor is they don't have a single organized, single strong organization. Each individual chamber or chapter of the Knights of Labor is kind of self-ruling, and Terence Powderly and the national organization just kind of gives a loose association to them. One thing that's significant about the Knights of Labor is that membership, and this will be really the only union in the time that can say this, membership is granted regardless of skill, whether you're an unskilled laborer or a skilled laborer, race, or sex. Unfortunately, in Chicago, in the Haymarket Square, there's going to be a riot that breaks out. Non-Knights of Labor union members, they're actually anarchists, throw a bomb into the crowd, killing, I believe, 2 policemen and injuring another person. Because it had started off as a Knights of Labor peaceful protest and had been escalated by outside forces, it's going to damage the Knights of Labor reputation, and by the 1880s the Knights of Labor has pretty much crumbled. However, the Knights of Labor does show the power of unions, especially when they go across craft lines, allowing both those skilled and unskilled laborers. And here's a picture, and certainly this is not all of the General Assembly of the Knights of Labor, but showing the inclusion of women. I'm sure that baby was not in the Knights of Labor, probably just along with his mother, but showing that the acceptance of women in the early trades union movements. As the Knights of Labor slowly dissolves after the Haymarket Square riot, the AFL picks up in its place. The AFL is led by Samuel Gompers. Sorry, there's a video link here. If we have time in class, we'll watch it. Samuel Gompers was an immigrant to the United States. He's a Jewish immigrant, and he had started in the cigar rolling business. He's going to start and lead the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, in the 1880s. And we're going to see his name continually popping up because he's actually going to be the head of it until the 1920s. And I really credit him and his longevity with making the AFL such a powerful union. Today in the United States, the AFL is one of the largest and most powerful unions. Remember, this is still the Gilded Age. It's not a huge union. It's the only real national union, though, we're going to have. Although it's small, it is significant. The AFL, though, originally is only made up of skilled labor. You must have some kind of skilled trade to work in it. They sought practical objectives such as better pay, better hours, and better conditions, which will sometimes be known as bread and butter unionism or unionism plain and simple. Bread and butter implying that they just want the basic bare bones demands. They're not looking for utopian things like this 8-hour league. They're going to come in and where there might be a 12-hour workday, negotiate it down to a 10-hour workday, negotiate slight increases in pay. Eventually, the skilled labor is going to include a third of all U.S. laborers, although this is still off in the future. They exclude women, blacks, and unskilled laborers. And by blacks, I really should say all other non-Caucasian races, because certainly Chinese or Native Americans are not going to be included in the AFL at first. I mean, obviously today it's a very different story. And they're going to exclude unskilled laborers, so that's going to change as time goes on, and we'll talk about that more when we get to the 1920s and 1930s. And the AFL is really going to use the first successful use of collective bargaining, bringing all of the workers together, and rather than individuals going to their boss and asking for individual raises, forming a collective and using that to negotiate with management. They're going to use contract labor and political pressure by the unions to vote for candidates and to support candidates for running for election and while in office. One thing that's driving the union movement at this time is the financial conditions. Although we kind of saw in the last lecture, businesses are immensely successful. Individuals like Rockefeller, like Carnegie are becoming hugely rich. The economy is actually not doing so great. Although the American economy is growing, we looked at the statistics, we're the biggest economy by 1900. For common people, there's a long depression. It's kicked off in 1873 with the Panic of 1873. Before the Civil War, we talked about the Panic of 1837 and 57. Now we're going to have two bookended panics, 73 and 93 in the Gilded Age. What kind of kicks this off is the United States decides to abandon the gold standard that had been put in place with the Legal Tender Act. For common people and common laborers, it is a period called the Long Depression because it lasts over 20 years. It actually extends past the Panic of 1893. So throughout the 19th century, and we've talked about this before, we see a cycle of what's known as like boom and bust periods. There had been a very small panic in 1819, a slightly larger panic in 1837. In between there was a lot of economic growth of things like the American system. After 1837, we'll see a lot of economic growth until the Panic of 1857. And then we see a lot of economic growth after the Civil War until 73. But then we have this big panic. And this is all this boom and bust. You have big boom periods, a lot of growth in between the panics, but then bust periods of the big panics. And this is all going to culminate really with the Great Depression in the 1930s, starting in 1929 really, of economic growth alternating with economic contraction. And one of the big causes for the Panic of 1873 is the abandonment of the gold standard, or more specifically, the old ratio, the 16-to-1 ratio. That's abandoned originally for the 18-to-1 ratio, then 20, then 22, and climbing up to 24-to-1 ratio of gold to silver. So that's, for instance, 16 ounces of gold is equivalent to 1 ounce of silver. And what it's going to do is serve to inflate gold but deflate silver, making gold even more and more precious, or diminishing the value of silver. When we talk about the populace in the 1890s coming up, this is one of the things that they're upset with, the abandonment of the gold to silver ratio. And in the 1890s, this is going to be labeled the crime of 73, because it's in 1873. Because farmers have easier access to silver because it's cheaper, it's in wider circulation, more abundant in the West, and harder to get gold. They see this favoring East Coast capitalists who can get gold over American farmers. This is also somewhat started by an event called Black Friday, in which Jay Gould, the most hated man in America, tries to corner the gold market. He tries to buy up all of the gold. At that point, President Grant finds out about this and releases gold into the economy. It ends up leading to massive market instability. There's also a concurrent flu epidemic, which is the subject of the book My Antonia, a classic book in American literature. If you read it at all, you probably won't read it until senior year. So this is not a good time. You have a flu epidemic, you have difficulty getting money, and now you have a financial panic. That's kicked off when a company, Jay Cook and Company, which is a railroad financing company. The railroad has been over-speculated on, and Jay Cook and Company goes bankrupt. And what that means is they default on their payment to a bank, which leads to the bank's failure, and which ends up leading to massive bank runs, people running to the bank to get their money out, to withdraw their money before the bank closes. The problem is banks finance loans by taking people's deposits and loaning them out to others, so they don't always have your money in hand. If you have macroeconomics this year, you'll talk about this much more in depth with Mr. Woodworth. But banks only keep a certain percentage of your deposit on hand, the rest they loan out. And so this ends up leading to a trickle effect. When the bank that Jay Cook and Company defaulted to goes bankrupt, all of its payments also go bankrupt. And by 1876, you see 14% unemployment. That's about 2% more than we saw with the most recent real estate boom in the United States in 2008 and 2009. And this kicks off the beginning of the Long Depression. Although there will be gains in business, for common people, the economy is depressed. Nearly a quarter of America's banks end up going bankrupt during this period, and about a third of U.S. businesses end up closing. So, because you have this Long Depression, you also have a period during the Long Depression known as the era of strikes, because simply the vast number of strikes. Here we have about 5 major strikes highlighted on this map, but if you see in the red, that's any county reporting any kind of strike. We're going to focus on just a handful of them, beginning with the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. This is sometimes called the Great Railroad Uprising, the Great Uprising, but it's the big strike in 1877. And it starts with a strike on the B&O line, and ends up leading to railroads from West Virginia all the way to California being closed down, because the B&O was one of the major trunk lines on the East Coast, and eventually results in hundreds of deaths because so many other local places, local unions end up rising up in sympathy strikes, and you see a lot of violent clashes between strikers and local police. The next big one is the Chicago Haymarket Square riot in 1886 that we talked about before with the Knights of Labor. The Unionists, the Knights of Labor workers, were demanding that 8-hour day, and it ends up expanding beyond the Union to larger mob violence and the death of the Knights of Labor. This is a figurative death. They weren't put to death, but it did result in the actual death of 2 Chicago police officers and a civilian. So here's the quick slide, what I was saying on the B&O. It lasts 45 days, spreads into Maryland. There's 10 dead there, 25 wounded. Pittsburgh, the Illinois Railroad starts a sympathy strike. So do coal miners, called the Shamokin Uprising. And eventually federal troops are called in to stop the strikers, but this really serves to just exacerbate the violence, especially the deaths. And this is why the National Guard is created. The National Guard is to keep law and order here at home, and it's created during this era of strikes to really keep law and order with union members. So we're going to talk about a few more strikes later on, but there's two to begin with. You should know the Knights of Labor, the AFL, and when we pick up next, we'll be transitioning more into immigration. So I'll see you then.